The stagecoach rattled down the dusty trail, its wheels creaking and groaning with every rut in the road. Eleanor pressed her gloved hands together, trying to steady the tremble in her fingers. Her bonnet shaded her face from the harsh sun, but it could not shield her from the eyes of the other passengers who had long since noticed how pale she looked. She was a mail-order bride, and today she would meet the man who was to be her husband. The thought made her chest ache with nerves. She had never imagined her life would come to this, boarding a coach and traveling across miles of wilderness to marry a stranger. But after her parents passed away back in Missouri, leaving her with little more than debts and fading memories, the future had seemed like a dark and narrow hallway with no door at the end. The only light had been the advertisement she'd seen in the paper. Widower rancher seeks respectable Christian lady for marriage. Must be willing to help raise a young child. Steady home and provision offered. The words had tugged at her heart. Perhaps because she'd always dreamed of being a mother, though she'd never known if she was meant for marriage. She was quiet, shy, easily flustered. Men in her hometown rarely looked her way, and when they did, they laughed at her hesitations and downcast eyes. But here was a man who wanted not just a wife but a mother for his little girl. It had been enough to make Eleanor answer. Now, as the coach slowed before a small, weathered station at the edge of the town of Red Creek, her heart pounded so fiercely she feared it might leap out of her chest. The driver called out, "End of the line!" and the passengers began gathering their belongings. Eleanor smoothed her skirts, rose, and stepped down onto the packed earth, clutching her small carpet-bag. The air smelled of horses, dust, and something faintly sweet, wildflowers that grew along the roadside. She turned her eyes toward the cluster of people waiting nearby, and that was when she saw him. He stood apart from the others, a tall man with broad shoulders, weather-tanned skin, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His hat cast a shadow over his brow, and he leaned slightly on the post beside him, as though he were not quite certain he wanted to be there. Eleanor's breath caught. This had to be him. Her husband-to-be. He pushed away from the post and approached, boots kicking up small puffs of dust. His presence was so commanding that the other men waiting for freight or family stepped aside instinctively. When he stopped before her, Eleanor lowered her gaze to the ground, afraid of what she might see in those gray eyes. "You, Eleanor?" His voice was deep, measured, carrying the weight of a man used to working the land. She nodded, unable to find her voice. "I'm Thomas Reed." The name she had read in the letter. The widower rancher. The man who expected her to be strong enough to keep his home and raise his child. She felt small before him, like a sparrow facing a hawk. He studied her for a long moment, and she wondered if disappointment flickered across his face. Did she look too plain? Too frail? She had never been beautiful like the other girls back home. Her hair was a simple brown, her eyes downcast, her figure modest. At last, he gave a short nod. "Come on then. I'll get your bag." She tried to protest, but he had already taken the carpet-bag from her grip as though it weighed nothing. Then he turned toward the waiting wagon. Eleanor followed, her heart pounding. And then she saw the child. A little girl sat perched on the wagon seat, her small hands gripping the edge of the bench. She had her father's gray eyes, though hers were lighter, softer, like a cloudy morning rather than a storm. Her hair was pale gold, tumbling in uneven curls around her shoulders. She watched Eleanor with a kind of guarded curiosity, lips pressed into a line too serious for her tender age. "This is Clara," Thomas said, helping Eleanor onto the wagon before climbing up himself. Eleanor offered the girl a tentative smile. "Hello, Clara." The child tilted her head but said nothing. She simply looked at Eleanor as though measuring her. The silence stretched as Thomas flicked the reins and the wagon rolled forward, leaving the town behind. Eleanor sat stiffly, afraid to speak, afraid not to. She stole glances at the rancher beside her. His jaw was strong, shadowed with stubble. His hands, gripping the reins, were calloused and large. He did not seem cruel, only reserved, as though words were a currency he did not care to spend freely. The road wound past fields of tall grass and distant hills. Here and there, cattle dotted the landscape, and Eleanor wondered if they belonged to him. The land seemed vast, endless. How could she, a quiet girl from a little town in Missouri, belong here? At last, Clara spoke. Her voice was soft, almost timid. "Papa, is she the one?" Thomas glanced down at his daughter, then back at the road. She is. Clara's gray eyes turned toward Eleanor again. Are you gonna stay? Eleanor swallowed hard. If you'll have me. The little girl did not answer. She simply tucked her chin against her chest, as though retreating into herself. Eleanor's heart ached at the sight. This child had lost her mother. She must be no older than 6, maybe 7. What wounds lay hidden in that small heart? The wagon reached the ranch as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the fields with gold. The house was modest but sturdy, its porch lined with a railing that had been worn smooth by time. Barns and corrals stretched beyond, and the sound of cattle lowing carried on the wind. Thomas helped Eleanor down, and for a moment their hands brushed. Heat rushed up her arm, and she pulled back quickly, embarrassed. "You'll want to see the house," he said. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. The furnishings were simple: a sturdy table, a few chairs, shelves lined with worn books. The house felt lived in, but also empty, as though laughter had not echoed within its walls for a long time. "This'll be your room," Thomas said, leading her to a small chamber off the main hallway. A narrow bed, a dresser, and a washstand filled the space. It was plain, but clean. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a short nod and turned away, as though uncertain what else to say. Clara lingered in the doorway, half hidden behind the frame. Eleanor knelt, lowering herself to the child's level. "Would you like to come in, Clara?" The little girl hesitated, then stepped inside, her eyes wide. Eleanor smiled softly. "It's not much, but maybe we can make it feel a little more like home." "Do you think so?" Clara's lips parted as though she might answer, but instead she stepped closer. Her tiny hand reached for Eleanor's sleeve, tugging gently. Eleanor's breath caught as the girl leaned close, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Will you be Mama?" The words pierced Eleanor's heart like an arrow. Her throat tightened, and tears stung her eyes. She reached out, brushing a curl from Clara's cheek with trembling fingers. "I'll try, Clara," she whispered back, her voice breaking. "If you'll let me." The little girl's arms wrapped suddenly around Eleanor's neck, surprising her. For a moment, Eleanor froze. Then slowly, she held the child close, her heart swelling with a fierce protective love she had not known she carried. In the doorway, Thomas stood watching, his expression unreadable. But for the first time since she had met him, Eleanor thought she saw something soften in his eyes. The morning sun spilled through the small window of Eleanor's room, painting the walls in soft gold. She had barely slept. Clara's whispered question, "Will you be Mama?" still echoed in her heart. Every time she thought of it, her eyes stung, and warmth surged in her chest. She had feared she would never belong here. But perhaps the child's heart was already making room for her. Eleanor rose quietly, straightened her dress, and braided her hair before stepping into the kitchen. The house was hushed save for the faint creak of floorboards. Thomas was already seated at the table, sipping coffee from a tin mug, his broad shoulders bent slightly forward. Clara sat across from him, swinging her legs as she nibbled on bread. "Morning," Eleanor said softly. Thomas looked up, studying her for a moment before giving a brief nod. "Morning." Clara beamed. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor." The girl's brightness made Eleanor's lips curve in a shy smile. She crossed to the stove and busied herself with preparing a simple breakfast: scrambled eggs, biscuits warmed from yesterday, and slices of ham Thomas had left from supper. She wasn't much of a cook compared to some women, but it felt good to move about the kitchen, to contribute. Thomas's eyes followed her from time to time, though he said little. When she set the food on the table, he cleared his throat. "You didn't need to do that. Wasn't expecting you to." Eleanor folded her hands together nervously. I wanted to. It feels right." Something unreadable flickered in his gaze, but he gave no reply. Clara, however, clapped her hands and said, "It smells real good, Papa." That small praise was enough to soothe Eleanor's fears. The days that followed passed in a rhythm Eleanor had never known before. Morning chores, washing, tending to Clara, preparing meals, and learning to help with the lighter ranch work. Thomas handled the cattle and the heavier labor, but now and then, he let her walk with him along the fence lines or into the barn. At first, their conversations were brief, practical. "Careful there. Hand me that rope. Best keep back from the bull." But gradually, the silences between them grew less heavy, less awkward. One evening, Eleanor found Clara asleep by the hearth with a rag doll clutched in her arms. She bent to lift the child and carried her to bed. As she tucked the quilt around her, Clara stirred and whispered, "Don't go away." "I won't," Eleanor whispered back. When she turned, she found Thomas standing in the doorway, his hand braced against the frame. His expression was shadowed by lamplight, but his voice was low, almost gentle. "She's taken to you quicker than I expected." Eleanor lowered her gaze. "I'm grateful. I was afraid she might not." He hesitated, then stepped into the room. "She misses her ma every day. Been near 2 years since the fever took her. Clara don't say much about it, but I see it in her eyes." Her heart ached at the quiet grief in his tone. "I can't take her mother's place, but I'll do my best to love her." His eyes lingered on her face, as though searching for something unspoken. At last, he gave a slow nod. "That's all I could ask." Still, doubts gnawed at Eleanor. Did Thomas want her only as a caretaker for his daughter? Or did he see her as a wife in truth? She was shy, inexperienced, untouched. She had been honest in her letter. She was a virgin, had never courted a man properly. Would a rugged rancher like him grow tired of her quiet ways? The question haunted her late at night when she lay awake listening to the wind rattle the shutters. One afternoon, while Thomas was away mending a fence, Eleanor took Clara down to the creek that wound through the back pasture. The girl splashed her hands in the water, giggling, while Eleanor sat on the bank, skirts gathered around her. For the first time in years, she felt light. Needed. Wanted. But when they returned, Thomas's voice cut through the air, taut and sharp. "Where were you?" Eleanor startled, clutching Clara's hand. "Down by the creek. I thought." His jaw tightened. "You ought to tell me before wandering off. Anything can happen out here. Rattlers, coyotes, worse." Her cheeks burned. "I didn't mean." He raked a hand through his hair, sighing. "I ain't angry. Just, I can't afford to lose either of you." The words struck her still. Either of you. Did that mean he considered her part of them already? Eleanor swallowed hard, nodding. "I'll remember next time." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the air between them seemed charged with something neither could name. Clara tugged Eleanor's hand then, breaking the moment, and scampered inside. That night, Eleanor stood at the window of her room, gazing at the starlit sky. A soft knock came at her door. She turned, heart racing. "Come in," she whispered. Thomas stepped inside, holding his hat in his hands. His expression was grave, uncertain. "I owe you an apology. For earlier. I didn't mean to make you feel scolded." "You were only worried," Eleanor said softly. "I should have thought." Silence hung between them, filled with all the unspoken words neither dared utter. Then Thomas drew a slow breath. "Eleanor, when I sent for a wife, I thought I was just doing what was practical. Clara needs a woman's care. The ranch needs a steady hand inside the house. But," his voice faltered, and he looked down at his hat, "I didn't expect you." Her pulse fluttered wildly. "Did I disappoint you?" His head snapped up, gray eyes fierce. "No. You surprised me. You're stronger than you think, even if you don't see it. Clara's already asking if you'll be her mama. And me," he broke off, shaking his head. "I find myself wanting more than just a partner for chores. I want a partner in life." Eleanor's breath caught. The shy words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I was afraid you only wanted someone to cook and care for her. Not me." He crossed the small room in 2 strides, stopping just before her. His nearness made her knees weak. "I want you, Eleanor. If you'll have me." Her heart pounded so hard she thought he must hear it. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to his. I don't know how to be a wife." His hand lifted, rough fingertips brushing against her cheek with surprising gentleness. "We'll learn together." For the first time, Eleanor didn't lower her eyes. She let them linger on his, saw the raw honesty there, the hunger tempered by restraint. Then, as though drawn by a force greater than herself, she leaned in. His lips met hers in a kiss that was tender, hesitant at first, then deepening with unspoken promise. When at last they parted, she whispered, trembling, "Yes, Thomas. I'll be your wife in truth." The weeks that followed were brighter, filled with laughter Eleanor had never dreamed would echo in her life. Clara clung to her hand, calling her "Mama" now without hesitation, her voice ringing with joy. Eleanor learned the rhythm of the ranch, the warmth of Thomas's steady presence, the strength of his arms when he drew her close at night. Love, she realized, wasn't something loud or grand, it was in the quiet moments. In the way he reached for her hand as they walked to church. In the way Clara leaned against her, content. In the way Thomas's eyes softened whenever he looked at her. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in hues of crimson and gold, Eleanor stood with Thomas on the porch. Clara played nearby with her doll, humming softly. Thomas slipped his arm around Eleanor's waist. "Don't tremble any more, do you?" he murmured. She smiled, leaning into him. "Not when I'm with you." He kissed her temple, his voice husky. "Then we'll make sure you never have reason to again." And as Clara's laughter rose like music on the evening air, Eleanor knew she had found not just a home, but a family, and a love that would carry her through every storm.